In November 1943, a barely known group of tiny islands in the Pacific would become the scene of some of the bloodiest fighting in World War II. The Japanese would defend their island furiously, almost to the very last man, against an invasion of U.S. Marines. After it was taken, the island group would become known to the world as Tarawa. Ellis Simon was a PFC Marine. This is where he met the enemy, on the battlefront. From 1941 through most of 1943, the Japanese military has occupied the Gilbert Islands, located 2,500 miles southwest of Hawaii. In the Gilberts is a group called Tarawa. Its principal island is Baishio, 3,800 yards long and 600 yards wide. This tiny, previously insignificant atoll has become an airfield and a defense system for the Japanese. It is one of the most heavily fortified islands in the world. Barbed wire surrounds the island. There is a daunting seawall constructed of coconut logs on the beaches. Huge guns guard the coastal approaches. Anti-aircraft guns and machine guns are strategically placed throughout the island. A series of shelters with 5-foot thick concrete roofs and 10-foot thick walls has been constructed. The Japanese have also moved in 4,500 of their best Marines to defend the island. The commander, Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki, confidently declares that Tarawa could withstand an invasion force of 1 million men.
The Japanese Imperial Navy was very serious about the defense of Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands because they saw it as their first line of defense in the Central Pacific against any U.S. advances towards Japanese possessions in that region. Shibasaki was a strict disciplinarian. He trained the garrison on Tarawa night and day. He systematically organized an interlocking defense built around multiple pillboxes and enclosures.
By November 1943, ships of the newly formed American Fifth Fleet began steaming toward the Gilbert Islands for the conquest of Tarawa. Aboard are 18,000 Marines, the 2nd Marine Division, tough veterans of previous engagements. Among them is Private First Class Ellis Simon, trained in anti-aircraft artillery.
Before Tarawa, we were at Nuka-Fatau, which is one of the islands, but it was an occupational force. It was, we were there trying to get there before the Japanese got there.
On board, the Marines are briefed about the operation.
They showed us a map of the island, you know, telling you what wave you're going in and all of this kind of stuff. You could stand in the middle of the island and see ocean on all 4 sides. That's how small it was. When we were going there, we knew we were going to bomb for 3 days, planes and ships and everything. We're going to bomb it. And that should lay it out so we could get onto the island, and then it was up to the infantry to take it from there. We were the 3rd wave, and we figured we would go in probably around a day or so later. See, we weren't infantry, we were anti-aircraft artillery, so we did not have to hit the island first.
The invasion is set for November 20th. 1 week before, 400 planes began round-the-clock bombing. Since the air bombing cannot knock out all of Baishio's defenses, there is an all-out effort by cruisers and destroyers. As far as the high command is concerned, the bombardment will have one objective. It will not neutralize. It will not destroy. It will obliterate the defense on Baishio.
According to radio messages that were sent back to Tokyo, about 100 sailors were killed or wounded in all of the air attacks. Where the air attacks had better success was obviously against the above-ground installations. They destroyed the airstrip and a few aircraft, barracks, some supply dumps, and some searchlights that the Japanese used for anti-aircraft defense. The Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces had a platoon of light tanks to destroy the attackers while they were still on the beaches.
Marine officers are briefed on the Tarawa assault plans. The landing includes amphibious tractors as well as conventional landing craft to take forces over the coral reef to 3 beaches called Red Beaches 1, 2, and 3. After landing, the Marines are to sweep across the airfield in the center of the island and push the enemy down the long, narrow part of the island. Some opinions estimate the operation at 3 hours. Others think it may be longer.
They figured to have it taken in about 7 to 10 days. Like any Marines, they were confident. You know, the bravado with the Marine Corps, that's the way it is. We think nothing will stop us.
Early in the morning of November 20th, Batio comes into sight. The Marines finish a steak breakfast and climb down the cargo nets into the landing craft.
The naval bombardment's greatest effect was an unintentional one. The ferocity of it cut all of the land communication lines that connected the Japanese bunkers with their command headquarters. And what this achieved, of course, was severing command and control. The Japanese positions couldn't talk to one another.
After 30 minutes, the shelling is halted to allow one final airstrike before the landing craft start their run onto the beach. Through a planning blunder, the planes are late. For those horrible 20 minutes, the Japanese fire on the unprotected landing transports. Finally, at 6:15, carrier bombers sweep over the island for a 7-minute bombardment. After the planes, the naval bombardment is resumed. In 2.5 hours, 3,000 tons of explosives have pounded the island. If the Marines are going to make it onto the beaches, the Japanese defenders must be wiped out.
A second unintentional result of the naval bombardment occurred during the afternoon of the first day of the Marine assault. Naval destroyers operating close inshore by pure chance happened to kill Admiral Shibasaki and his key staff. This, in effect, rendered the Japanese garrison leaderless.
The Japanese wait and watch the landing. Part of their plan is to make the Marines think they have been immobilized by the intense incoming artillery. For the unsuspecting Marines arriving in landing crafts, the plan works until they get close. Then all hell breaks loose. On day 1 of the invasion of Tarawa, Marines struggle to move off a narrow beach, but are pinned down by the entrenched Japanese.
From the Japanese point of view, for every Marine they shot, and they shot and killed hundreds of them, another Marine simply seemed to pop up and continue the fight. So on the first day, the Japanese did inflict heavy casualties. They did contain the beachhead, but because their communications were so completely disrupted, they were unable to take advantage of this and follow up with the counterattack.
To help break the logjam, carrier-based planes bomb and strafe almost continuously. By the end of November 20th, 5,000 Marines have made it onto the beach. About 1,500 of them are wounded or dead. As the men dig in for shelter from the enemy, nobody is sure how this operation is going to play out. The next morning, the last of the divisional reserves start to wade ashore, exposing themselves to Japanese gunfire. Halfway across the reef, they are suddenly cut down. During the night, Japanese machine gunners have hidden themselves in an old half-sunken hulk. Carrier planes come in to put them out of action. For 5 desperate hours, the reserves continued battling their way ashore. With the decimation of their numbers, when more reserves are needed, none are available. Finally, at noon on the second day, more than 36 hours late, the tide rises, and with it rise the prospects of the invasion force. For the first time since the operation began, landing craft get over the top of the reef. Men and supplies pour onto the beach. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, the commanding colonel reports, our casualties heavy, enemy casualties unknown. Situation, we are winning. Success on the beach makes it possible for the infantry to move further inland and have the anti-aircraft artillery come on shore.
As we advanced in, we'd bring the guns in, unload them on the beach, and then we'd have to bring them in to where we were going to place them on the island. Whoever was in charge would say, this looks like a good place for a 40 millimeter. So they'd start digging that in. The only thing we worried about was snipers. They were very shrewd. They would tie themselves up in palm trees. So if you fired back, you didn't know if you hit him or not because he wouldn't fall. He was tied in it. As we advanced in and in, you'd run into maybe one shot here and then all of a sudden another shot from someplace else.
By late afternoon on day one, the Japanese were pretty well beaten up. Not only were their losses heavy, but their communications were gone. What this meant was that each Japanese bunker, instead of being part of an integrated, coherent defense, now was isolated. Their world became very small.
All afternoon, casualties are evacuated. The landing craft move them out to the waiting ships in a steady shuttle service. Meanwhile, the Japanese continue to resist.
Well, that was it with any island they had. It was a fight to the death. I mean, that's the way they believed, and that's the way it was. It's pretty hard to fight the guy that says, well, I'm going to fight you till I die. That's the way it was.
Pushing the Japanese back, Marines now clean out bunkers. The smell of death is nauseating in the tropical heat. While the battle continues, the only way to take care of all of the bodies is to dig mass graves and lay to rest the Americans on one side and the Japanese on the other. Bulldozers cover the remains. On the third morning at Tarawa, the Japanese commander sends out his last message. Our weapons have been destroyed, and from now on, everyone is attempting a final charge. May Japan exist for 10,000 years. On the morning of the fourth day, there is another sickening revelation. The night before, the Japanese ran screaming into the Marine lines in a last frantic banzai charge. Their 300 dead bodies are strewn across a grim landscape. Only 500 Japanese are still alive. The Marines move in against these final defenders in a steady and relentless approach. From 8 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, the Marines are able to eliminate 475 of the remaining 500 Japanese.
Being inside a Japanese bunker, a Japanese soldier must have felt that he was in his own tomb. By this time, casualties were heavy. The whole tiny atoll just reeks of cordite. It reeks of rotting corpses because, remember, you're only about 100 miles north of the equator. The dead bodies are already decaying. You've probably got... Robert Sherrod, a correspondent who covered the landings, later wrote a wonderful book about the battle. And in there, he has a chilling description.
To those who fought to the death, this tiny hunk of coral costs 4,500 Japanese lives and 1,000 Americans. As Japanese armies advanced through Burma to take India in the spring of 1944, they met resistance from British forces determined to push them back. Japan's goal of conquest instead became a retreat which took the lives of 50,000 men. Ron Tingey was a private in the 36th Division of the British Army, here on the battlefront. In early 1942, Chinese forces defending themselves from the Japanese under the leadership of American General Joe Stilwell are soundly defeated.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma. It's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
It would be 2 years before American forces could accomplish this. Early in 1944, Japan begins its last drive of the war into India. On March 6th, the vanguard of Japan's army crosses the Chindwin River in Burma, opposite the Imphal plains of India. Within a few days, 80,000 Japanese troops are making the long trek toward the towns of Imphal and Kohima on the Indian side of the border.
The average Japanese soldier in Burma on the front lines in late 1943 or early 1944 was well trained by Japanese standards. He was well equipped. He was a tough soldier and followed orders. The problem for the Japanese in Burma was not the infantrymen. The problem was their high command. Lieutenant General Mutaguchi Renya was likely insane. Mutaguchi was a type of officer who loved a brawl. He loved, literally, the blood and guts of warfare. General Mutaguchi's attack on Imphal and Kohima was to be completed before the onset of the rainy season in Burma, which would be the end of May of 1944. Mutaguchi was obsessed with this operation, and he pushed hard for it. He pushed his troops mercilessly because he wanted to conclude the campaign within 3 months.
Japanese Lieutenant Mutaguchi's plan to attack less than 2 months before the monsoon rains carries considerable risk. If the Japanese are not victorious before the middle of May, they can become trapped. 1 to 10 inches of rain a day falls during that time. It washes out the mountain trails behind them and floods entire valleys, preventing a line of retreat. Japanese supply lines will be cut until October. There is very little time for delay. Tough troops from India in the British Army help defend their country.
The Japanese regard for the Indian troops within the British Army was quite low. They were contemptuous of most so-called colonial armies, although the Indian formations in the British Army fought quite well during the war. But the Japanese held most of their enemies in contempt, British or Indian.
But even with Indian troops, the British forces are routed. By early April, the situation around Imphal is critical, and it's worse at Kohima. British General William Slim calls up more troops from southern India to strengthen his army in the north. Ron Tingey is a private in the Royal Sussex Infantry under General Slim.
They trained us well in India. I had 3 months jungle training and with the real stuff flying about, you know, give you some idea, but Burma's a different place to India. But my job was look after the brain gun and all that, automatic weapon. And we went in as an infantry battalion. The first job we did, we were taking a place called Hill 60. We got pinned down there for hours. They were red hot. And then we see the bombs come over, I see the bombs come out, and they blew the hill up and went up. And we took the hill, and all the Japs up there were blown to pieces.
The Japanese launch an attack from several directions to isolate the British. 30 miles north, they establish a strong roadblock between Imphal and Kohima. General Slim has a strategy that involves taking rectangular positions so that it's impossible for the Japanese to outflank him. The defenders also have the advantage of nearly 100% air control. British and American planes can hamper enemy troop activity and disrupt their supply lines and communication. The British benefit greatly from a combination of air power and General Slim's battle plan.
By this time in the war, the Japanese army in Burma had really no air support. Many of the air squadrons had been transferred to the Pacific, originally to the Solomons and New Guinea, and they really lacked any air defense against British fighters.
The British in Kohima are caught short of both food and ammunition, but they are resupplied by airdrop. Since the Japanese and British positions are so close, both armies benefit from the drop.
Had the Japanese had significant air power, they could have interfered with this resupply effort from the air, but as it was, without air power, they were simply unable to prevent aerial resupply, which was a very important tactic and a very important development of the British in Burma during World War II.
You could feel very low sometimes, and then sometimes you could feel okay. I think most of it were pretty low, because we never seemed to get a rest, if you know what I mean.
By the middle of May, the British are turning the tables on the Japanese. Around Kohima, the enemy is on the defensive. In the Imphal area, air attacks and patrol activity cut off Japan's ability to resupply its troops. Lord Louis Mountbatten visits his troops in the field.
He'd come round and anybody were there, he shook hands with him and said, how's it going? And I'd say, okay, you know. He said, how's the food? I said, horrible. And things like that. Told us how well we were doing and keep it up and all that, you know. Promised we were going to get more men. We didn't, but they are. Bumped us up at the time.
Mountbatten tells the men the Japanese don't think the British will fight during the monsoon. However, they're in for a surprise. The British are about to take the offensive. Mountbatten promises his men all the help they need, and if that isn't enough, he expects additional support from General Douglas MacArthur and the United States. The British troops are energized by Mountbatten's presence.
By the time the monsoon hit in May of 1944, turned turgid streams into swollen, raging rivers, just making it that much more difficult for the Japanese to retreat. Furthermore, the troops were soaked. Their clothing was wet and soggy and started to rot in the high humidity. Mutaguchi's plans to destroy the British and seize Imphal and Kohima were already smashed. Nonetheless, Mutaguchi insisted on holding on.
When the monsoon starts, you're up to your chin in sludge, you know. I mean, it was terrible in the monsoons, 3 months of monsoons, going through the jungle. I've been in a dry riverbed, and within 2 hours it's been flooded. You couldn't keep dry. It was just a waste of time trying to keep smart. You couldn't. You used to strip off, or you used to take all my clothes off and have a bath and wash my clothes and everything, still wet through. I mean, some lads, they got held up for months and months and they couldn't move because it took them about 3 days to travel a mile.
June 22nd, 1944. British patrols link up on the Imphal-Kohima Road for the first time since early April. The Allied supply line is intact again. The British have stopped the invasion of India. Now they must take back Burma, just as General Stilwell wanted. By July 1944, the British have smashed the Japanese invasion of India. With their supply lines cut by the monsoon, the Japanese face starvation and are running out of ammunition. For a few disciplined units, the retreat is orderly, but for most, it is a rout. Between them and the safety of the central Burma plain lie mountains more than 9,000 feet high and dense jungle.
The Japanese retreat was just marked with one disaster after another. They had no supplies. There were no medical supplies available. Food was short. They had no ammunition for the equipment that they carried. So it just took a tremendous toll on the Japanese physically and psychologically to try to retreat during the monsoon. The other problem it created, of course, was thousands of Japanese troops couldn't. They were abandoned. Almost 60,000 troops perished in the attacks on Imphal. Only about 20 to 30,000 of them died in combat. The others died of starvation or disease along the route of retreat. So it really just shattered the army completely.
With temperatures soaring well above 100 degrees, the trek back is not for a weakened army. If it was straight, it would be at least 230 miles long. The way the Japanese must travel, it's closer to 500 miles.
They just...
We used to have a mob called a suicide mob, about 50 or 60 of them, and they'd go in anywhere, you know. Oh, they're all things like that. There's some brave men. I can't remember all the names, you know, but most of the leaders were a full corporal.
During their retreat from Imphal, I think even Japanese spiritual power collapsed. The conditions were just too appalling. The battle itself had been too harsh. The fact that so many high-ranking commanders had been relieved, and the fact that General Mutaguchi himself had been more or less relieved and sent off to Tokyo to the general staff, were just crushing blows to morale. The Japanese simply could not sustain it.
The retreat continues through the summer and fall. By December, 50,000 Japanese have died. 5 Japanese divisions have been destroyed. The other side of the coin, the British 14th Army has lost 40,000 men, killed or wounded since Kohima.
Well, there was good officers as well as bad ones. I mean, when you go in action, it makes a big difference. But the experience I had with one officer, he was just paralysed. What he was going to do and what he wasn't going to do. And when he got there, and the real action with the bullets were flying about, he got in this trench and he stopped there. We had 1 or 2 lads, you couldn't get them out the split trench without frightened. On the whole, the men I was with were pretty good. We got well supplied and plenty of airdrops. You get different colours for different things, like black for mail, red for ammunition, yellow for so. I used to make shirts out of them and walk in them.
The troops who made it through the mountains and reached the Central Plain really had no respite. First of all, they were a tattered, ragged army. Most of their equipment was lost. 2 out of every 3 had perished or were missing after the retreat.
The Japanese are now under the command of General Hoyotara Komura. He sees the situation in much the same terms as did the British at Imphal. His supply lines have shrunk, while the enemy's are extended precariously. General Komura knows that the decisive battle in this campaign will take place on the central plains of Burma. But General Slim does not accommodate the Japanese with a pitched battle. While supposedly advancing with 2 Army Corps toward Mandalay, where the Japanese are waiting for him, he secretly dispatches most of his 4th Corps 100 miles south. January 8, 1945, advance units of the British 33rd Corps reached the Irrawaddy River, 50 miles north of Mandalay. Not having been able to bring assault boats with them through the jungle, the British have to cut down trees to build their own.
All these troops were concentrating getting to Mandalay. I mean, the 3 battalions of the Scots regiments, we met them, the Royal Scots Fusiliers and all that, all trying to cross the Irrawaddy at the same time. And they're all making for Mandalay. That was the main point with the Jap war. That's what we thought about. Getting to Mandalay, mate, and getting rid of them all and all that, you know, and getting out of it.
In mid-February, the battle for Mandalay is on.
We were pushing them back. They were running away from us all the time. Only time they come to us, there used to be snipers. They left about 20 or 30 behind sniping at us, you know, to run hold us up. They never got past us at all. They were different parts of Burma, like I said about the infill. Now, some of our lads got over bashing there, we were told, right? I mean, we were split up right across Burma. might be in action for about 5 or 6 days, and the Japs move back from one village to another. Then we follow them through and keep pushing them and pushing them. And we pushed them for 1,500 miles. And all the Burmese people were pleased to see us when we got to the villages. I can't remember all the names of the villages, you know. I remember some of them.
March 20th, 1945, Mandalay falls.
So once the tables had been turned on the Japanese, many Burmese quickly switched sides. Units of the Burma Defense Army, for example, crossed over to the British en masse and began fighting the Japanese. So what used to be considered a friendly environment for the Japanese had now become a deadly one for them.
All British units are now diverted to the south for a final link-up against the Japanese. On May 3rd, 2 British forces meet in Rangoon and find the city abandoned by the enemy. The 3-year Japanese occupation of Burma is ended. Ron Tingey is not in Rangoon for the victory. Outside of Mandalay, he is caught in an enemy explosion. His best friend sacrifices his life to save him. Private Tingey is injured and permanently blinded. He will be hospitalized in Calcutta for 6 months and then return to England.
I got full of shrapnel in my arms and my chest, and I got a bullet in my leg and my ankle. I was in there for till end of 45, I think.
The loss of Burma in 1945 exposed all of the Japanese conquered territories to Allied attack. The loss of Burma left the Japanese defenseless in Southeast Asia. Their entire strategic flank had been crushed.
As the United States prepared for the invasion of the Philippines, scheduled for late 1944, the tiny Palau Islands had to be taken first. The well-entrenched Japanese were ready to fight to the last man. It was a bloody campaign with heavy losses on both sides. Jasper Hood was with the Marines at Palau and faced the enemy on the battlefront. By the summer of 1944, the American strategy to regain control of the Pacific is succeeding, with victories in the Gilbert, Marshall, and Mariana Islands. The goal of this island-to-island conquest is to allow General Douglas MacArthur to liberate the Philippines. One potential Japanese stronghold remains, the Palau Islands. On a tiny island in this group is a strategically placed airfield. That base is Peleliu. Because of its location, the Japanese expect an American invasion. General Sadai Inouye is expected to assign 10,000 crack troops to hold the island. General Inouye has structured his defense plan not on the typical massive charges of past Japanese campaigns, but on a new defensive system which will cause heavy losses to the Americans.
The Japanese had really 2 kinds of fortifications on Peleliu. One was the natural terrain, this rugged terrain with coral ridges. The other, of course, were the caves that they developed. They used oil drums filled with concrete. They basically turned them into bunkers, which were essentially impenetrable to air attack. There were some that were like 5 stories deep. They have their own electrical generating system, sophisticated communications equipment, air conditioning. It was an engineering marvel. They're interesting in another respect. They were a rare example of cooperation between the Imperial Japanese Army and the Imperial Japanese Navy. They usually rivals, didn't work together, but on these they did. The Japanese working conditions were just terrible. In Peleliu, it was very tropical, it rains a lot, the temperature's over 100 degrees. It's little wonder that when they finished them, named them for favorite beauty spots in Japan, to think of something other than the conditions that they were actually working in. The troops that were there Some had been in reserve units in the Guangdong Army in Manchuria, hadn't seen much fighting recently. They weren't on the front lines at all. But others were from China proper, where there had been intense fighting, and their leader was decorated 9 times for heroic leadership. So they were ready to fight. The Japanese had reason to believe that they could hold out, maybe even be invulnerable, because, first of all, they had this idea that spirit can prevail over matter. Secondly, they had the advantage of this really rugged terrain.
With more than 500 caves being prepared, General Inouye appoints Colonel Kunio Nakagawa to command the forces on Peleliu. Colonel Nakagawa deploys his unit strategically on both Peleliu and Ungwar Island. Even though the Japanese commanders believe in their defensive abilities, they still give an order to fight to the last man. The Japanese are alerted that Americans are closing in on the Palau Islands.
This brought a sudden realization that they were vulnerable to American air power, and also in terms of the larger picture, where the focus is really on the Philippines. Peleliu is meant to be fought in connection with the defense of the Philippines, or the attack on the Philippines. The Americans could bomb Japanese forces in the southern Philippines. The whole question of whether Peleliu is really important or not is very highly debated. Some people say it was Admiral Nimitz's biggest mistake to insist on fighting to take Peleliu.
Among the 20,000 men involved in Admiral Nimitz's controversial plan called Operation Stalemate is a private first class in the 1st Marine Division, Jasper Hood.
There was some disagreement among the people when they were planning to go there. I won't say it was a 50-50, but there wasn't an overwhelming desire to have a landing at Peleliu. But somebody's opinion was honored until we made the landing.
On orders from Admiral Nimitz, the 3rd Fleet swings into action. For 10 consecutive days, carrier-based planes strike Peleliu and all supporting bases. The main objective of all this activity is the airfield in the south. Along the northern end of the island is an unbroken ridge covered by dense foliage. This high ground is the key to control of the airfield. A gunfire support group of battleships begins a bombardment that will continue for 4 days. Heavy cruisers also move in to take part in the shelling. Meanwhile, Colonel Nakagawa's troops are hidden deep in the caves, well protected from the bombardment, hunkering down for whatever the Americans can throw at them. On the day before the invasion, the fleet admiral sends a dispatch that he has run out of targets to bomb. Marine generals predict victory in 4 days.
You have to try to think positive if you can. Nobody wanted to be there. I met very few that loved to be there. Because and if anybody had told me, I'd call them a liar anyhow. Because now, if anybody loved that, they need to see their head shrink, because they weren't thinking too good.
For the men waiting to meet their destiny at Peleliu, there's plenty of time to think about their orders. They are supposed to make it to the beach and take hold of the island. September 15, 1944, landing craft set out from ships with the first waves of Marines. Many of the men put on camouflage paint. They find it good for their morale to feel ready for battle. Then come the 2 most critical orders in the operation. Stand by to disembark, followed by all Marines, lay to your debarkation stations. As a landing craft touches down to the water, the men inside know that some of them won't be making it back to the ship. Some Marines won't admit to the possibility of being killed, while others are resigned to the reality that their number could be up. Most of them are there to serve their country and hope for the best. When the landing crafts reach the transfer control line just beyond the reef's edge, Japanese smoke shells begin to fall. Smoke screens block the Marines' view of what's ahead.
Before we landed, you had this horrendous bombardment before the first wave hit. Now, once you start ashore and you start landing, most of that kind of stuff ceases after all the shelling and bombs stopped. So the Japanese came out, set up their mortar shells and their artillery pieces. They already had the beaches zeroed in, and so they just started unloading. We just jammed up on that beach. I don't know how many waves stacked up, but I know we were stacked up on that beach. That's why when they zeroed in on those amphibious tractors that were carrying us in, we jumped out before we got to the beach, one at a time, you know, as opposed in a group. In waves, you know, the first wave, now you've got X minutes to move up where some planets that you're supposed to be. So when the next wave comes in, that first wave is gone. And then it just goes back. So when wave 5 comes in, the first 4 are gone. Well, that looks good on paper, but it doesn't always work that way. And it didn't there either.
The assault waves press on, but the landing does not go as well as the generals planned. The Marines are pinned down by a deadly crossfire, and there's no cover at all, except behind a dead Marine.
We just piled up on the beach, and they were lobbing those shells into our landing craft. And when you've got a whole bunch of troops on the beach, you're just sitting ducks. Lost a lot of people. Apparently it was hellhole, hot. It was a dinky place. I don't think it was more than 3 by 2. They had the high ground, and so there was no point in them charging us on low ground. We had to get them. Besides that, they had such good cover. And it was just dirt scratching to get them out of that place.
From his hidden vantage point on the high ground, Colonel Nakagawa radios General Inouye. Reinforcements unnecessary. Invasion will be crushed by end of day. September 15th, 1944. 30 minutes into the invasion of Peleliu, when Marines should have been establishing a beachhead, wave after wave of assault troops are hopelessly pinned down.
When the Marines attempted to land at Peleliu, they were greeted by a hail of shells filled with smoke to create a smoke screen, which caused a lot of confusion, slowed them down, made them more vulnerable as targets for Japanese artillery that was focused on the landing site.
It takes 4 hours of raging battle for the Marines to advance only 50 yards. Admiral Nimitz's operation has prophetically lived up to its name, stalemate.
The island of Angkor is about 5 miles southwest of Peleliu. In the context of the fighting, it's important because it's flat. You can build an airfield there. After the Americans landed on Peleliu, the defenders at Angkor had to ready themselves for an American attack. And they didn't have the advantage of terrain that they had on Peleliu, so they just were entrenching themselves. Flight of about 50 American aircraft came over, and they were struck just about sunset time, which had a devastating effect on their morale. And some of them took this as an omen of things to come in the future.
The day after invasion, 2 regimental combat teams of the U.S. Army land unopposed on Angkor Island. What they don't know is on the northwest end of the island, 1,600 Japanese soldiers are ready to follow orders and fight to the death, even though they are hopelessly outnumbered. While the fighting goes on, American engineers arrive on Ungvar to construct an airfield in the event the one on Peleliu is not captured. On Peleliu, Colonel Nakagawa prepares to launch his counterattack to crush the invasion once and for all. Concealed behind the network of underground tunnels, Japanese forces mobilize from all over the island.
It isn't that you aren't scared, but you're not scared 24 hours, you know, the degrees of being scared. You're in a dangerous situation. And yeah, there's that possibility you're going to not make it. But I don't really think too many people dwell on it because it's not good for the soul. It's a job, and you do it, and what happens, happens. See, what made this so bad, it was hotter than Hades. 110, 115, 120, it was just blistering hot. We had as many casualties from heat exhaustion as we did gunshot, maybe even more. We were supposed to have the airfield within an hour after we landed, but it wasn't the opposition on the ground. It was how they had it zoned in from those caves in that mountain that was down the middle. So you had to sort of get rid of some of that.
A single massive unit forms to move down from the high ground, cross the airfield, and strike at the heart of the American line. The Marines expect a banzai charge. Instead, the Japanese advance slowly, protected by 13 tanks.
The Japanese had only light tanks in contrast to the amphibious version of the American Sherman tank. And so when they got together, the Japanese were decimated. Again, bad impact on their morale. Then, of course, they have to be prepared for the idea that the Americans are going to advance further towards the northern end of the island, where they really are entrenched in these caves.
Nakagawa's counterattack fails. All his tanks are destroyed. His best infantry divisions have been decimated. The Marines regroup and head for the airfield.
I think it took 4 to 5, 6 weeks, I believe. I don't know the exact time. But it wasn't an overnight affair. War is not planned. You plan it, but it doesn't work out according to plans too many times.
The battle for the lowlands of Peleliu is almost over. Soldiers are able to tend to the wounded and add up the losses. Some companies have lost over 50% of their men. 500 Japanese corpses also litter the battlefield. Reserves land to reinforce the Marines. They bring with them supplies and food. September 19th, with temperatures of 115 degrees, Marines climb the slopes of the Coral Mountain, where the Japanese have their defensive caves. In the blistering heat, they must assault and reduce each holding position one at a time. After 8 days of this kind of fighting, some companies are pulled back to a safe beach. Then they're returned aboard ship for some rest and relaxation from battle. For those who are wounded, their tour of duty is over for the moment. September 23rd, when the Marines get to the large caves, they are hit hard. American casualties mount rapidly, and the Marines give this mountain a name. They call it Bloody Nose Ridge.
Bloody Nose Ridge was basically refers to the high ground, and the Japanese had the high position here, so they felt that they were confident. I mean, tactically, normally, the people who have the high ground can fire down on the attackers coming up from below. So they were super confident. And indeed, they did inflict a lot of casualties on the American forces who did persist and eventually take those heights.
You're trying to get 5,000 men out of a cave that you no way you're going to get into unless you want to lose everything you've got. It's going to take a while. But it was just one opening at a time. That's just how it played out. The only way you did it, you just flamethrowers, or you just spark them. Some kind of explosive that you threw in the opening, and that would tend to close the opening.
The situation on Angkor grew increasingly desperate for the Japanese. In 6 hours, 1,500 Japanese were killed by American troops on Angkor. The survivors, there were a few survivors, tried to dig in to escape the flamethrowers. They were trying to entrench themselves in trench because you didn't have the caves like you had in Peleliu itself. So they're just trying to dig down to escape the attack. The conditions for the Japanese on Peleliu as the battle approached its conclusion were absolutely terrible. They were short on rations, food, water. They faced this overwhelming American force, which was heavily armed. But they maintained their spirit, their morale, even though they knew they were defeated.
Finally, after weeks of combat on Peleliu, the capture of caves comes to a climax. American troops now penetrate the last pocket of resistance. What they find is astonishing. This is the largest underground complex on the island fortress, capable of holding more than 1,000 troops.
The troops that were there had not been exposed to big battles where flamethrowers had been used, and so the possibility that they could be used, they could just burn in these things and die that way of asphyxiation, must have been terribly frightening to them. Yet, they stuck it out. They prevailed.
On October 12th, 1 month after the initial bombings, the 1st Marine Division, with half its troops out of action, declares the assault at an end. For Marines like Jasper Hood, the news couldn't be better.
And nothing better than getting out of that crumb that you've been living in, and you're not going to get shot at anymore. When you're under 4 months of hell, it does something to you also. And when you had to climb up those cargo nets to get back aboard ship, it was like walking up the steps. Some guys couldn't do it. There's nothing nice about a war. Nobody wins.
For some Japanese holdouts, fighting would continue for 6 more weeks. Even then, a handful of soldiers refuse to believe they have lost the battle.
In 1947, they found 33 holdouts on Peleliu who were still in the jungle and hadn't given up and weren't going to give up and had to be persuaded to finally give up and surrender and admit that the war was over.
In the fall of 1944, General Douglas MacArthur made his historic return to the Philippines as Americans started the final push to retake the islands after 2 years of Japanese occupation. It was to be a bloody confrontation with one of the highest body counts of the war. Here, 200,000 American soldiers faced 200,000 entrenched Japanese troops on the battlefront. In the fall of 1944, the Japanese have held the Philippine Islands for more than 2 years. But the American drive across the Pacific has broken through other Japanese defense lines and is heading towards the Philippines. More than 200,000 men are brought in to defend the islands. To command this army, the Japanese picked the Tiger of Malaya, Tomoyuki Yamashita, regarded by many as Japan's greatest general.
In September of 1944, the Japanese knew that the Americans would likely strike next at the Philippines. But the Japanese High Command was split on how to defend the Philippines. General Yamashita Tomoyuki on Luzon, the northern large island, wanted to defend that island. And however, Imperial headquarters in Tokyo insisted on fighting the decisive battle on Leyte.
Yamashita sends only one division to Leyte. He will let the Americans strike, then use the full force of the Japanese Army, Navy, and Air Force to crush them. The bulk of Yamashita's army is kept on Luzon, from where he will launch a crippling counterattack on Leyte. October 15th, the U.S. 7th Fleet and transport head for the Philippines. Over 700 ships. Aboard are more than 200,000 men of the U.S. 6th Army, veterans of Guadalcanal, New Georgia, Bougainville, and New Guinea, under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, who must deliver the 1-2 punch to liberate the Philippines. First they hit Leyte, then Luzon. 16 waves of assault troops are to go ashore. One of these units is the 1st Cavalry Division, assigned to a mile-long stretch of sand called Beach White.
The U.S. Army's 1st Cavalry Division was an old pre-war regular formation. Many of its soldiers had been in the regular army before the Second World War. Originally, the purpose was to use horse transport to provide mobility in places such as mountains, where trucks would find it difficult to move. As World War II broke out, it became apparent that there really wasn't much call for cavalry, and their training shifted away from cavalry training to infantry training. So when the 1st Cavalry went overseas, it did so as an infantry division, although many of the units did indeed embark carrying their saddles, hoping to find horses overseas.
One of the reasons that the High Command opted to fight on Leyte was that they believed the erroneous and inflated battle plans of both the Japanese Navy and Air Force pilots. Japanese claimed that they had sunk several American carriers, destroyed battleships, and many of the Japanese troops believed that all they had to do was land on Leyte to accept General MacArthur's surrender. This was completely opposite of fact, but it was the kind of mistaken intelligence that drove the Japanese decision to fight the decisive battle of the Philippines on Leyte. The Filipinos had a mixed record with the Japanese. In the larger cities, there was probably a great deal of collaboration. This didn't mean the Filipinos liked the Japanese or endorsed their policies. Philippine communists, on the other hand, in northern Luzon, waged an unremitting and vicious guerrilla war against the Japanese, as did American-led Philippine-American guerrilla units that were scattered throughout the islands.
American bombing runs hit Japanese ships in Manila Bay near Bataan. They also bombed planes at Clark Airfield, diminishing Japanese air power. General MacArthur's convoy heads for Leyte, but a network of mines blocks the entrance to Leyte Gulf. Minesweepers and demolition teams are called in to clear the way. For 24 hours, American guns bombard the island of Leyte. At the dawn of Invasion Day, the shelling is turned on full force while the Army sets to go ashore.
The 1st Cavalry Division was committed to the Philippines in an amphibious landing on the island of Leyte in the Philippines. This was part of General MacArthur's famous promise, "I shall return." The impact on the men involved, even though they had trained for months in Australia, further north, in amphibious invasions, there must have been a great deal of fear and anxiety. They would come ashore then in open landing craft. When the bow ramp went down, even though there had been a very heavy preparatory bombardment, there was often very strong Japanese resistance. And on Leyte, even though the Allies were able to clear the beaches due to strong naval gunfire, resistance increased as the 1st Cav and the other U.S. divisions moved inland and the Japanese were able to bring in reinforcements. This had been the strongest resistance the U.S. Army had yet encountered in the Pacific.
Later, General MacArthur himself comes ashore on the land where 2.5 years ago he promised to return.
First Cavalry Division liberated Tacloban, which was one of the key reasons for the invasion of Leyte. This was one of the major airfields in the Philippines, and it did indeed show the Japanese were willing to destroy just about anything in the Philippines rather than let the Americans get it back.
Regaining the airstrip at Leyte's capital city of Tacloban now gives the U.S. air power the ability to strike at the main Philippine island of Luzon, where Manila is located. The Japanese Imperial Navy now launches a major battle plan. Operation Shogo means victory plan in Japanese. It involves massing 3 task forces from what remains of the Japanese fleet and attacking the U.S. Navy when it gathers to support the invasion of the Philippines. The American Third Fleet steams north right into the Japanese trap. But on October 23rd, American submarines locate the Japanese ships heading for Leyte Gulf and put out an alert. The Japanese cannot match the high-speed mobility of the American aircraft carriers. October 25th, the naval battle is all but over. The Japanese Navy has been eliminated as an effective striking force. Yamashita now believes there is no point in trying to face the Americans in Manila. The civilian population would immediately side with the liberators, and its flat topography would require too many troops. As a result, he sends his men to San Miguel in the Central Plains. When the Americans land at Luzon, the Japanese will be in a central position to attack.
As for the individual Japanese infantrymen, like infantrymen in any army, he really didn't know anything except the general orders that he received.
Yamashita leads his army into the hills. He has a force half the size of MacArthur's. The Japanese will dig in and wait for the Americans to come to them. But the Japanese Navy is under different orders and has no intention of pulling out of Manila. Instead, they cram 16,000 troops into an area of 14 square miles. Their plan of action? A fight to the last man. They turn the streets of the city into a deadly obstacle course. Mines, depth charges, even airplane bombs are placed in the path of the expected attack. Every house and every building is transformed into a small arsenal. Now it's up to the Americans to make their way through that arsenal. On January 9th, 1945, the second stage of the American plan to liberate the Philippines goes into action. Nearly 300,000 men in 15 divisions are involved in the operation, the largest army in the Pacific War. The landing puts the American army closer to Japan, so heavy resistance is expected, but it doesn't materialize. There is little opposition from the Japanese.
The 1st Cavalry was sent across the Manila Plain. General MacArthur himself personally formed into what he called a flying column. It was used, for example, to liberate the U.S. civilian prisoners at the Santo Tomas internment camp. And from there, it advanced on to the suburbs of Manila. As the cavalry approached Manila, it countered General Yamashita's overall defensive plan. So he would bring them into what he called a fire sack on the plains of Luzon. And this is what MacArthur and General Kruger, 6th Army commander, had to maneuver around.
The troops have a saying. The Japanese fight for their emperor, the English fight for their king, and the Americans fight for souvenirs.
The Japanese, as they withdrew, were very adept at booby-trapping anything. So other than that, troops would pick up practically anything they could carry.
Finally, by the end of January, the Army's rear flank is secure. The big push is now on to head for Manila.
As the 1st Cavalry and the rest of the U.S. Army advanced in Luzon, they met a strong pro-U.S. guerrilla movement. These helped the liberation of prisoners, they provided local guides, and they made sure that the Japanese had less intelligence and were limited in their movements.
The 1st Cavalry follows the assault troops through the villages of Luzon. Wherever there's a space on a wall, soldiers leave their mark. That way, incoming troops know their fellow soldiers have cleaned out the village.
After the capture of Leyte, the Japanese High Command simply wrote off Luzon and Yamashita. Yamashita was ordered to live off the land, to make do with what he had. Tokyo informed him he could expect no resupply, he could not expect any more assistance, and he could not expect any more reinforcements. In other words, Yamashita would have to stand and fight to the very end, isolated and alone.
The Japanese make futile calls for air support, but their Air Force can no longer help.
In this situation, about all that Yamashita could do, really, was retreat into the mountains with his surviving troops and try to hold out in a mountain redoubt. And in fact, he did this very skillfully.
Bombers chased the Japanese all the way into the mountains.
Japanese soldiers went overseas not expecting to return alive. Normally, they left cuttings of their hair or fingernails to memorialize themselves after their death. The martial Japanese song, Umi Yukaba, has the lines, "I shall die only for the emperor. I shall never look back." While they knew the Americans were coming, they also knew that it was their duty to stand and fight against the Americans. The idea was, as long as the Japanese continued to fight on Luzon, they'd drain resources from the Americans that otherwise could be used in an invasion.
Thousands of Japanese soldiers die from hunger and sickness. All over the land, there are piles of Japanese corpses. Many of the companies have a survival rate of no more than 10%.
The Filipinos in general were delighted to see the Americans. They had no love for the Japanese occupation. Even the Philippine government, quote unquote, which had collaborated with the Japanese, had been in touch with MacArthur, had been in touch with the U.S. secretly during the war. So there was very little support for the Japanese by the Filipinos. They were delighted to see the Americans as their liberators and look forward to support them.
In less than 3 days after starting their drive, American troops are at the gates of Manila. One of the fiercest battles is waged at the Manila Ballpark.
At one point, the U.S. held one half of the ballpark, the Japanese held the other. One of the dugouts were turned literally into fighting positions. So the two great baseball-playing nations, the U.S. and the Japanese, ended up fighting a bloody urban battle over several days in the Manila Ballpark.
The Japanese continue to hold Manila, mainly with sailors from ships sunk nearby, using guns taken off these ships. They also make a concerted effort to kill as many civilians as they can. This puts pressure on the 1st Cavalry Division to push the Japanese back before they kill innocent Filipinos. For a full week, Americans fight their way forward against a vicious Japanese defense. By mid-February, with his communications cut, General Yamashita belatedly learns of the battle raging in Manila. He orders the commander there, Admiral Iwabachi, to pull out all troops at once. Iwabachi insists it's too late. The Americans have him surrounded. All withdrawal routes are cut off, and escape is impossible. However, for Iwabachi, the alternative of surrender is no alternative.
Given the magnitude of the Japanese army infrastructure on Luzon, there were more than 250,000 troops there. It became a massive killing ground because your best units had already been wiped out on Leyte, and the surviving units were now under strength and without any possibility of resupply.
On March 3rd, the Japanese have been defeated and Manila is liberated. But what was once considered the Pearl of the Orient is now a massive graveyard of 1,000 Americans, 16,000 Japanese, and 100,000 Filipino civilians.
The fact that the United States was willing to fight, to liberate friends and allies became a very important factor in post-war relations, not just with the Philippines, but elsewhere in Asia.
The loss of the Philippines really isolated Japan from the resource-rich areas of Malaya, the Netherlands, East Indies, Burma, so it was a tremendous loss.
More than 13,000 Americans and over 200,000 Japanese are killed in the battle for the Philippines. When the war ends, the Japanese are still fighting here on this battlefield.
America goes to war. Men of the Army, Navy, and Marines reinforce the battlefronts on 6 continents to save the homes and ideals of free men from Axis domination. In Ireland, United States fighting men who have safely crossed the submarine-infested Atlantic strengthen their ever-increasing ranks. Yanks on the march on Irish sod. The worldwide conflict brings intrepid American airmen to China's heroic fighting front. General Chennault, United States Air Force chief in China, flies with his brave command to strike effective blows at the invading Japs. Later, with Colonel Scott, he observes his men in action. 10,000 miles from home, men and supplies pour in through India, the last doorway to China. Cheerful yet determined, welcome strangers in a strange land. Off the coast of Alaska, jutting sharply into the Pacific and the slate-gray Bering Sea, lie the bleak Aleutian Islands. Here, Jap airmen bomb American soil and ships. Here, our defenders seek the enemy, determined to drive him from American shores. Destroyers guard transports and cargo ships to land troops and supplies on a fog-swept island near the enemy-held Kiska. Men, stores, and ammunition pour in for the Battle of the Aleutians, a battle that Americans must win. American naval guns open up on the Jap-held Solomon Islands. At Guadalcanal, United States Marines in a swift, surprise invasion add new glories to the fighting career of their illustrious corps. The retreating Japs attempt to destroy their newly completed air base. It is quickly captured by the Leathernecks and renamed Henderson Field. The Marines, later reinforced by Army troops, battle fiercely to hold their ground. Some of the enemy escape in a hurry. Others get out of the fight as prisoners. History recorded as it happened. The Marines are the first to raise the American flag on enemy territory. Seeking out and blasting Hitler's U-boats is the rough, tough job of naval aviators and men of the Coast Guard. Hundreds of ships, including vitally needed tankers, are hit, burned, and sunk, victims of prowling enemy submarines. American waters become a battlefront. In the Caribbean, more ships run foul the enemy fire, but greater combat action gets results as convoys steam through to their destinations. Russia meets the grim test. Despite repeated attacks by crushing panzer units, pushing on desperately toward the Caucasus and into the streets of Stalingrad, Marshal Semyon Timoshenko's relentless armies take a terrific toll of the enemy and upset his invasion timetable. The Russians meet the Nazis in close and often hand-to-hand fighting. A German sniper is picked off by a Soviet sharpshooter. Another Nazi tries to surrender, but too late. Britain's Prime Minister flies to Moscow. Eyes and ears the world over are focused on a conference of historic importance. Churchill meets Stalin behind the walled fortress of the Kremlin. Rio de Janeiro, nerve center of the largest country in South America, is the scene of a history-making demonstration. All-out war is declared as a result of the ruthless Axis attacks on Brazilian ships and an appalling loss of lives. Brazil goes to war.
Joseph Stilwell would be among those who received their baptism of fire. Over there was the patriotic song of the hour. Over there sailed young American manhood to fight in the first international conflict of our history. With the temporary rank of major, Joseph Stilwell disembarked in France during the bleak, disheartening December of 1917. There followed a brief period of service with the British Division. Then, with his fluency in French, he became liaison officer with the French 17th Corps. For the young major, there was action at Verdun, Le Fère, Toul, Saint-Mihiel. For his service in this last engagement, Stilwell, now Assistant Chief of Staff, 4th Army Corps, received the Distinguished Service Medal. For military attainments of a high order, read the citation. Japan systematically occupied or blockaded one after another of China's port cities. In effect, Japan built a wall around China. Deprived of needed supply from without, a weakened China would be vulnerable to the heavy blows of the invading forces. The former American observer Stilwell was now back home again, serving at California's Presidio. A major general, he commanded the 3rd Army Corps. Step by step, history was setting the stage for its climactic tragedy. Out of that tragedy, Joseph Stilwell would emerge to play a heroic role. From a country stunned by disaster, General Stilwell was sent to China, there to serve as chief of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek's Allied staff, and with a small American staff to take nominal command of China's 5th and 6th armies. The new responsibility brought him his 3rd star. In the absence of clear-cut Allied command lines, General Stilwell's first job was to help in the defense of Burma. Burma offered the only route by which material aid could be fed into China. China must be built up, made stronger and stronger until her allies could join her in going over to the offensive. The Burma which was to know Stilwell's exploits had become a battle scene. General Stilwell and his Chinese, together with outnumbered British, Free French, and Dutch troops, fought on. But the effort was doomed. jungle, across rivers and mountains, to the safety of India. In the ordeal, Joseph Stilwell's full stature revealed itself. Refusing the comforts his age and rank might have claimed, he personally conducted one group of 400 battered troops, Burmese nurses, and civilians to the safety of India. There, at New Delhi, he was to utter the now classic admission of defeat and announce his determination to go back and wipe it out. There was the honesty, the directness, the tough moral fiber that characterized the man.
I claim we got a hell of a beating. We got run out of Burma, and it's humiliating as hell. I think we ought to find out what caused it, go back and retake the place.
Although his bluntness of speech earned him the nickname of Vinegar Joe, to the millions of men who served under him, he was the kindest and most modest man who ever lived. To all of them, he was, and in memory still remains, Uncle Joe. The battered campaign hat and shirt sleeves now became a familiar sight. General Stilwell would not have cared what they called him, as long as they did their job. Stilwell was truly a soldier's soldier. He shared the hardships and dangers of his men and gave the phrase real meaning. Stilwell had the unique capacity for commanding respect and obedience while evoking a genuine affection. Perhaps no group regarded the general and the man with warmer feelings than did the Chinese troops in his command. It was no secret that General Su, as he was called, had consistently extolled their courage and promoted their welfare, often in the face of adverse opinion from above.